Good morning. My name is Sherry Pasternak, and I'm joined by my colleague, Gillian Rogan, and we will be moderating today's report launch. We are members of the Jewish Faculty Network and co-authors of the CIJA report. We want to begin with a statement on behalf of the JFN and our co-authors. The JFN stands behind the release of this groundbreaking report, which documents the virulent racism at the heart of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs political agenda. In schools and on campuses across the country, in newsrooms and lobbying meetings, this pro-Israel lobby group stifles teaching and learning, attacks scholars and people of conscience, spreads misinformation about the history of Israel-Palestine, and pressures policymakers and administrators to curb academic freedom and charter-protected speech. CIJA claims to represent the Canadian Jewish community and attacks the legitimacy of Jews who stand in support of Palestinians, yet it has no actual membership or democratic mandate. As Jewish scholars who refuse the weaponization of Jewish trauma and who insist on a diversity of opinion as a pillar of Jewish culture, we are alarmed that an organization that frequently mobilizes racist tropes about Palestinians, tramples protected rights and freedoms, sows division, and capitalizes on hate, is invited to dictate public educational materials on anti-Semitism and is routinely consulted on hate crimes legislation. Government and educational institutions need to be alerted to this report and consider seriously its implications for decision-making and policy implementation going forward.
In a highly litigious environment of lawfare, the JFN and report co-authors did not take the production of this report lightly. We expect to be attacked. We expect backlash and reprisals. We were guided by the urgency of genocide and attacks against the Palestine Solidarity Movement. We dedicated ourselves to analyzing 1,625 social media posts, 40 press releases, and 144 media quotes between October 7th, 2023 and March 29th, 2024. We committed our time to understanding these public statements using the framework of anti-Palestinian racism and considering the specific harms of anti-Palestinian racism, who it affects, and how. It is our sincere hope that this careful social scientific research will provide people with the tools to understand the history and status of this organization within the Jewish community and to act accordingly. We believe that CIJA's current influence is due to their overlap with state interests regarding the war on Gaza and Canada's policies on Israel and Palestine more generally. Resources matter. This is a fact for any lobbying efforts, and we reject in advance the maligned attempts to paint this report as one that is built on the anti-Semitic trope of Jewish people's undue wealth and influence on global politics. CIJA's power is not a product of their Judaism. It is a product of their political alignment with state priorities around security and criminalization, a documented history of Islamophobia, most pronounced in the so-called War on Terror, and a geopolitical allyship with Israel. This report is not an attempt to censure or censor CIJA. It is aimed at social, cultural, educational, political, media, and other institutions to engage in this critique when presented with an opportunity to canvass for a Jewish opinion, or when confronted with a smear campaign that reproduces the narratives we identify as racist in our report. This racism has been used to deny the State of Israel's genocidal campaign against Palestinians in Gaza. It must not be taken lightly. The Jewish Faculty Network has undertaken this work as an act of care and solidarity with Palestinians. This is not an internal Jewish debate we are provoking, but rather an analysis of a humanitarian crisis being justified and unfolding in our name. It is a human rights crisis for all Canadians of conscience to act upon.
We are joined here today by some of our co-authors, all of whom are members of the Jewish Faculty Network, and also by three esteemed colleagues, all of whom will speak to various aspects of the harms caused by CIJA. Our first speaker is Avi Lewis. Avi is a professor of geography at the University of British Columbia and a member of the Jewish Faculty Network. He's a candidate for leader of the federal NDP and a co-author of the CIJA report.
Hello, everyone. Let me zoom out to start. Israel's genocide in Gaza is a livid scar on the soul of humanity. The world has watched this genocide in real time, and despite everything tried by millions of people around the world, week after week for 2 years, we have been unable to stop it. And now, even if this apparent ceasefire holds, the genocide will continue. If not in daily mass murder, then certainly in the supremacist logic that still seeks to drive Palestinians out of Palestine. It's not over. In fact, we are just now beginning the time of disinterment, the recovery of likely more than 10,000 bodies lying underneath a society worth of rubble. Each one was a precious human life. And as the US and Israeli governments focus the world's attention on the handful of Israeli bodies to be recovered, Palestinians are taking household hammers to the twisted cliffs of concrete and rebar to begin the excruciating long work of recovering their dead. This asymmetry reflects the balance of forces on planet Earth. Surely a majority of humans, appalled, heartsick, burning with grief and legitimate rage, versus a small minority self-righteously cheering on the murder of children, the assassination of the intentionally starved, the attempted erasure of an entire people. Here in Canada, our government, in fact, most of our political class and most of our mainstream media, is, I believe, deeply out of sync with the majority of Canadian people. In a recent poll, almost 2/3 of people said they want the Canadian government to recognize Israel's actions in Gaza as a genocide. And at the same time, our Prime Minister continues to insist that a future Palestinian state must be a Zionist one. A bizarre talking point that demonstrates just how out of touch our ruling class is. What explains this chasm? This asymmetry that enables and locks in the most searing injustice of our age? What force on earth is stronger than the human conscience and the evidence of our senses combined? These questions are at the root of the report we are launching today. For surely it is the power of a story. A story crafted in Israel and the United States and successfully told and retold over and over down the decades around the world. Here in Canada, it's a very familiar tale. It's a deeply colonial story about a good and democratic Israeli state that embodies the same progressive and inclusive values espoused by Canada. A tiny, noble country locked in intractable conflict with a threatening, violent, fundamentalist people who are not like us at all and represent a threat to our way of life. This is how Israel and Palestine have been represented in our culture since at least the 1950s. And the telling and retelling of that story is how our political and media class have been captured. And in Canada, one of the most powerful forces today locking in this fundamentally racist and colonial story has been the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. CIJA's lobbying efforts have had a huge influence on how this story shapes our culture, law, and conversation in Canada. CIJA's lobbying has shaped everything from the federal government's adoption of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, to the so-called bubble zone laws that criminalize protest, to the censoring of teaching and learning about Palestine in public schools and universities. And of course, the accusation of anti-Semitism leveled relentlessly against those who speak up or act in solidarity with Palestinians, and the narrative that it is actually Jewish Canadians who are most at risk, most in pain, most unsafe, most victimized. This is painfully absurd. Evidence CIJA's latest target, the very act of naming anti-Palestinian racism. Yes, CIJA claims with a straight face that merely naming anti-Palestinian racism somehow poses a danger to Canadian Jews. In an important way, this report is the product of our long-standing frustration as a group of Jewish scholars at pro-Israel lobby groups claiming to speak on behalf of the Jewish community as a monolith. For many decades, pro-Israel Jewish organizations have been suppressing aspects of Jewish identity, politics, and scholarship that are critical of Israel and Zionism, denying the long history of Jewish anti-Zionism, an identity and an idea that is needed now more than ever to break down and change the pro-Israel story that has gripped too many for too long. So the next time there's a loud, peaceful protest in support of Palestine, and CIJA describes it publicly with words like a violent anti-Semitic pro-Hamas mob, we hope that journalists will pause and think critically before transcribing it. We hope that policymakers and public officials will not continue to accept those kinds of words unthinkingly. We hope that politicians will speak out against this warped and damaging story in greater and greater numbers. We hope this work can be used to seed a different story, one that recognizes the fundamental humanity of Palestinians and the hateful, harmful impact of propaganda that denies that humanity and provides cover for genocide. We desperately need a new story, one that sees and values every human life, a story that begins to reckon with the enormity of the genocide in Gaza, a story in which the seeds of peace and liberation can take root. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Avi. We'd next like to invite, Sheryl Nestel to speak. Sheryl is an affiliated scholar with the New College at the University of Toronto and a member of the Jewish Faculty Network. She is a co-author of the CIJA report.
Thank you, Jill. Okay. Sorry. Give me 1 second here. So yeah, I think, first of all, I want to thank my incredible co-authors, Avi, Jill, Larry, Sherry, and Vanina, who have been amazing to work with and are all brilliant and principled scholars and activists and wonderful human beings on top of it. And it's been a really great pleasure working with all of you. The Gaza genocide, argues Ariel Angel, editor of Jewish Currents magazine, has made plain what many leftist Jews have long feared, that virtually the entire enterprise of Judaism and nearly every organization charged with stewarding it is infected with a voracious rot. But this rot, characterized by racism and genocide denial, is being challenged by dissident Jews around the world. Jewish Faculty Network, Independent Jewish Voices, Yiddische Stimme in Germany, and many others are not anomalous formations, but are rather part of a rapidly growing global movement of Jews whose condemnation of Israeli settler colonialism and the genocidal war in Gaza is unequivocal. In 2019, I helped found Global Jews for Palestine, a coalition of 25 self-defined anti-Zionist Jewish groups from 20 countries on 6 continents. There is not a group among us that has not doubled or tripled its membership since October 7th. Our very existence is a vital counterweight to the unconditional support for Israel voiced by legacy Jewish organizations worldwide. As explicitly Jewish Palestine solidarity activists, we feel a unique responsibility to challenge Jewish organizations like CIJA, whose alliances, actions, and pronouncements contribute in very material ways to the annihilation of Palestinian human rights and national rights, to the promotion of Jewish exceptionalism, and to the undermining of deeply rooted Jewish social justice traditions. Legacy Jewish institutions like CIJA fit perfectly into the current neoliberal moment. We can see this clearly in the political domination of Jewish communal institutions by a class of megadonors who exercise outside influence on Jewish life and politics. Glaringly excluded from official Jewish communal conversations and government-sponsored hearings and roundtables are the voices, of scholars, activists, and public intellectuals who are sounding the alarm about the moral failures and deadly consequences of Zionism. This report seeks to amplify those voices by bringing scholarly attention to the material and discursive work that anti-Palestinian racism does. As our executive summary states, our report finds that CIJA engages in racism, the dehumanization of Palestinians, the promotion of unconditional support for the state of Israel and its military, and the silencing, vilification, and criminalization of Palestinians, their allies, its supporters, including dissenting Jews. We can also recognize a distinctly Trumpian influence in CIJA's attacks on anti-racism initiatives like equity, diversity, and inclusion mechanisms in universities and organizations, their opposition to the decolonization of curricula across a wide swath of educational institutions, including public schools, their demands for increased policing in response to political protest, and the use of the legal system to discourage and thwart pro-Palestine activism. That having been said, we have to be able to talk about the impact of pro-Israel organizations on government policy, public opinion, legislation, policing, and academia, while refusing to resort to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories or to laying collective blame on Jews. As Hil Aked points out in their excellent book, Friends of Israel, mapping connections in power structures such as CIJA is the antithesis of conspiratorial thinking. David Cleon, writing in the New York Review of Books, and Ariel Angel, who I mentioned earlier, have both recently published articles calling for dissenting Jews to abandon those mainstream Jewish organizations, which have for 2 long years funded, supported, enabled, and indeed encouraged Israel's genocidal war on Gaza. These organizations, argue Cleon and Angel, are simply irredeemable. All of this, writes Ariel Angel, speaks to the need for new spaces, new containers for the exploration of anti-fascist Jewish life. The development of such spaces will make us stronger political partners from the vantage of both strategy and sustainability. We need, says Angel, to transition from pockets of rebellion to poles of power. The vision of a viable and ethical Jewish alternative to the regressive, racist, and undemocratic forces that have come to dominate Jewish life is within sight. Jewish dissidents will continue to produce knowledge like this report that challenges the Jewish establishment's appalling adherence to a brutal ethno-nationalism. We believe that now is the time to aggregate the voices and actions of Jews who dissent from the Zionist consensus so that we may reclaim our prophetic tradition and join those seeking long overdue justice for Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheryl. Our next speaker is Larry Haiven. Larry is a professor emeritus of labor relations at Professor Emeritus of Labor Relations at St. Mary's University, Halifax, Nova Scotia. He's a member of the Jewish Faculty Network and a co-author of this CIJA report.
Thanks, Phil. I'm a child of an Auschwitz survivor, professor emeritus at St. Mary's University, Halifax, honorary doctor of divinity, Atlantic School of Theology, founding member of the Jewish Faculty Network and Independent Jewish Voices. Start my video. Sorry, folks.
There you go.
Writer on Jewishness and anti-Semitism, and a co-author of this report. I'm an originator and teacher of IJV's workshops on anti-Semitism. I want to focus on CIJA's modus operandi in attempting to deflect criticism of Israel. It's happened like clockwork for decades, totally predictable. Israel does shocking, unthinkable, unimaginable things, war crimes, and CIJA and associates attack critics and try to change the channel to talk about anti-Semitism. I and a growing legion of Jews are fed up with it, like the 450 Jews across the world led by the former Speaker of the Israeli Knesset, Avraham Burg, who signed an open letter to world leaders yesterday. Here's another analogy. These accusations are like chaff, pieces of metal foil that fighter planes fire off to divert incoming missiles. The missiles go after the bits of metal, leaving the fighter pilots and their planes to bomb and kill another day. Our report and other speakers today highlight how CIJA and friends distort, obfuscate, and amplify accusations of anti-Semitism and malign Palestinians and their supporters precisely to achieve the same objective: throw chaff to defend Israel's indefensible. A half century ago, Jewish establishment organizations before CIJA pursued universal human rights by uniting with other vulnerable groups. But no more. Now their sole and solitary task is to defend Israel by weaponizing accusations of anti-Semitism. especially in the middle of one of the worst genocides of this century. Here's a recent example of both from my neck of the woods. In mid-September, several thousand Halifax folks ran a successful campaign against the attempt to sport wash Israel's occupation and genocide with a Davis Cup tennis tournament featuring Team Israel. In the end, the match organizers canceled the public audience, and the city and the province withdrew their funding. The same weekend as large protest marches against the tournament, two other things occurred in Halifax. First, a group of neo-fascist white supremacists rallied downtown Halifax against immigration. Second, someone shamefully daubed Jewish synagogues and cultural buildings with anti-Semitic slogans. How CIJA and its local associates reacted to these outrages speaks volumes. To the neo-fascist rally, they said, and they did, absolutely and typically nothing. In fact, it was the tennis marchers who confronted the white supremacists. On the anti-Semitic graffiti, CIJA and its locals were quick off the mark to smear the protesters, saying, quote, on the same weekend that extremists silenced fans from cheering on Team Canada, a Halifax synagogue was defaced with hateful graffiti, unquote, clearly implying the latter was done by the former. Mere days later, police announced they had someone in custody, a man in his early 30s, an apparently troubled person who operated independently and had absolutely no connection to the protesters. Enough of this bad faith. I call upon CIJA to apologize for using the incident to smear those who speak out against the genocide in Gaza. In the spirit of the recent Jewish high holidays, I urge CIJA to practice the traditional cheshbon nefesh, accounting of the soul, and seek forgiveness for the biblical sin of bearing false witness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Larry. Next, we have Dania Majid. Dania is the co-founder and president of the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association. She's also the co-founder and artistic director of the Toronto Palestine Film Festival. Welcome, Dania.
Thank you. Good morning. I first want to thank the Jewish Faculty Network and the authors of this important report for their courage and thorough research. The report details how anti-Palestinian racism operates at a systemic and institutional level. While CIJA is its focus, anti-Palestinian racism, used to defend and justify Israel's illegal occupation, apartheid, and ongoing genocide of Palestinians, is pervasive among many pro-Israel organizations in Canada. Since the ACLA's founding in 2005, we've both experienced and witnessed anti-Palestinian racism weaponized to undermine the rights, dignity, well-being, and security of Palestinians, Arabs, and allies. This has occurred by both the public and private sector and by the media. As outlined in this report, CIJA, along with its partners, were often advocating for this repression against our community. This repression, as intended, created a chilling effect around Palestinian advocacy and expression in academia and cultural spaces. For many in our community, they hid their identity, felt guilt for not engaging in Palestinian advocacy, and many were gaslit, told their fears of reprisal were paranoid or exaggerated. Yet their instincts proved right. In 2002, the University of Toronto Law School scandal confirmed these fears. In a rare instance, CIJA was exposed for their involvement in the de-hiring of Dr. Valentina Azarova. Documents revealed CIJA's coordination with the Israeli-based NGO Monitor, which labeled Dr. Azarova as a terrorist sympathizer and sought to block her hiring. CIJA contacted sitting tax court judge David Spiro, who is a former CIJA director and prominent donor to the law school, and asked him to call the law school to object to Dr. Azarova's appointment because of her work critical of Israel's violations of international law with respect to Palestinians. After Justice Spiro made the call, the law school rescinded Dr. Azarova's offer, which resulted in the university being censured. This international incident exposed the backroom tactics CIJA uses to silence critics of Israel and validated what our community had long known. The disclosure from the judicial review of this case produced the email exchanges and documents between the parties involved that outlined how anti-Palestinian racism operates within institutions. This CIJA-led scandal ultimately led to the ACLA developing its 2022 landmark report, Anti-Palestinian Racism, Naming, Framing, and Manifestations, which explained the experiences of anti-Palestinian racism and its many harms on individuals and the broader community. This JFN report references this framework and builds on our findings. Not surprisingly, since the release of the ACLA report, CIJA and its partners have attacked us and our work by labeling us as anti-Semitic, projecting falsehoods on our framework, and continuing to deny Palestinian lived experiences, including that of the Nakba and live stream genocide, despite the overwhelming international legal consensus of Israel's crimes. As outlined in this new report, CIJA's actions not only perpetuate anti-Palestinian racism, but also suppresses Jewish dissent and critical voices within the Jewish community. It is therefore imperative that institutions take seriously and implement the 5 recommendations made in this report to begin addressing this entrenched racism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dania. Next, we have Elle Jones. Elle is a poet, journalist, professor, and activist from Halifax, Nova Scotia. She is currently an assistant professor at Mount St. Vincent University and has taught at various other institutions such as Dalhousie University and Acadia University. Welcome, Elle.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Under the auspices of fighting anti-Semitism, CIJA continually pushes for more policing and security and the erosion of civil liberties of Canadians. The impact of calls for harsh policing of speech and protesting under the guise of fighting hate and terror symbols has led to numerous incidents of overcharging, over-policing, and escalated responses. In one of the most notorious examples, after protesters daubed washable red paint on a local Indigo books and attached flyers to the window as part of the Indigo Kills Kids campaign, Toronto police conducted pre-dawn raids of the residence of protesters. The investigation involved more than 70 officers, 10 nighttime raids, and cost millions of dollars, only to result in dropped charges and the failure to register any criminal conviction. CIJA spokespeople labeled this act of simple vandalism an example of anti-Semitic, hate-driven extremism. The premise that Jewish people in Canada can only be kept safe through these kinds of disproportionate police and judicial responses not only participates in racist and dehumanizing tropes that label Palestinians as inherently violent, hate-filled, terroristic, and counter to Canadian values and identity, it also endangers Black people, Indigenous people, and other marginalized and vulnerable communities as collateral damage for supposedly securing Jewish safety. Recommendation 34 of Canada's Black Justice Strategy, submitted in 2024, recommends, quote, that police agencies across Canada be mandated to make greater use of diversion programs as alternate justice processes that redirect individuals away from the traditional criminal justice system, focusing instead on rehabilitation, community service, or restorative justice measures, especially those that are offered by Black-led and focused organizations that provide identity-affirming services, supports, and programs. This priority recognizes, quote, policing as an important factor influencing the over-criminalization of Black people. Crucially, while limited, available data demonstrate that Black people are greatly overrepresented in police use of force cases and are disproportionately more likely to be killed by the police in Canada, unquote. Calls to enhance police powers, stifle civil liberties, and introduce harsh security measures cannot coexist with calls from the Black community to reduce reliance on police in favor of restorative and community-based measures. In order to secure their priorities, CIJA not only advocates for policies harmful to communities of color, but also deliberately mobilizes racist narratives to invoke a hierarchy of citizenship. For example, in response to protests in Halifax calling for the cancellation of the Davis Cup match between Canada and Israel, which concluded without a single arrest, CIJA continually mobilized a false narrative that the event was closed to spectators due to protesters intimidating spectators and violent threats. A narrative that Halifax Police, the RCMP, and CSIS all refuted and indeed indicated they were not even consulted about security. Despite the proven falsity of this narrative, CIJA continually appealed to Canadian values to remove hate and fear from our streets, suggesting that protest for Palestine is inherently un-Canadian, threatening, and violent. While advocating the need to fight hate, CIJA has regularly targeted Black people who express any solidarity with Palestine, including advocating for events addressing anti-Black racism to be shut down, speakers removed, and Black students and student groups suspended or disciplined, while demanding that those receiving funding for anti-racist initiatives accept the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism that has been widely rejected, even by its own writer. It is no surprise, then, that under CIJA's social media posts, you will frequently find calls to deport protesters of color, commentary about Muslims as a threat to Canadian values and security, dehumanizing rhetoric around non-white Canadians, and characterization of Muslim and non-white Canadians as savage, animalistic, and primitive. While CIJA demands pro-Palestine advocates condemn and denounce even unrelated incidents of anti-Semitism on different continents, holding the entire movement responsible, they have yet to make one statement on social media distancing themselves from or condemning the racist rhetoric under their own posts. That this racism emerges in response to CIJA's public rhetoric is not an accident. It is due to the alignment between CIJA's policy priorities, the narratives that they mobilize to accomplish these goals, and their political alignment with institutions and forces that exclude, harm, and criminalize Black people and other marginalized populations. Just as CIJA claims Jewish safety can only be secured through violence towards Palestinians, they mobilize a similar rhetoric in Canada to create a hierarchy of safety that harms the most vulnerable groups in order to suppress expressions of support for Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elle. As our last invited speaker, we have Professor Joshua Sealy-Harrington. Joshua is an associate professor and chair in Palestinian human rights in Canada at the Faculty of Law at the University of Windsor. Professor Sealy-Harrington teaches and researches about constitutional law with a focus on equality law, critical legal theory, and social change. Welcome, Joshua.
The concept of anti-racism is not an empty placeholder that CIJA can simply populate with whatever meaning it chooses. Rather, anti-racism denotes how racialized groups are oppressed, racism, and the project of stopping that oppression, anti-racism. As I will explain, because CIJA's so-called anti-racist advocacy requires racial oppression, it is rather racist advocacy and must be categorically rejected on that basis. Pro-Palestinian activism, including by brave student activists, is in stark contrast anti-racist advocacy. Specifically, it is anti-occupation, anti-apartheid, and anti-genocide activism. Despite the overwhelming racial oppression they endure, however, Palestinians are routinely excluded from Canada's conception of anti-racism. As Mohanad Ayash explains in an article cited in the Jewish Faculty Network's crucial report, there is a double marginalization of Palestinians in anti-racist discourse. The first marginalization, which all racial minorities confront, is in the racist conceptualization of white people as rational and objective, and non-white people as irrational and biased. But the second marginalization, particularly confronted by Palestinian analysis, is how that analysis is, quote, marked for a vigilance against its alleged racism and bigotry towards Jews, which marks it out for further hostility, even from within anti-racist, marginalized spaces, end quote. This racist distortion of Palestinian analysis, as predisposed to anti-Semitism, performs a racist function. If Palestinian equality is misinterpreted as Jewish inequality, then Palestinian advocacy becomes definitionally racist, when it is, as I just explained, clearly anti-racist. To illustrate this point, I want to highlight the conclusions in the Jewish Faculty Network's report. It summarizes false assertions that are disseminated by CIJA, and on close examination, these false assertions rest on the same false premise that the pursuit of racial equality is zero-sum. That is, the false premise that for Jews to be safe, Palestinians must be oppressed. One false assertion provides that unrestricted violence against Palestinians is necessary for Jewish safety. In other words, Jewish safety requires Palestinian unsafety. Another false assertion is that the supposedly terrorist pro-Palestine movement has caused a dramatic spike in anti-Semitism. In other words, Jewish safety requires Palestinian inequality. A third false assertion provides that protecting Jews and combating anti-Semitism requires restricting the civil liberties of pro-Palestinian protesters. In other words, Jewish safety requires Palestinian silence. Lastly, and perhaps most explicitly, one false assertion is that the vast majority of Canadian Jews are opposed to the pro-Palestine movement. This binary and false framing could not be clearer. Pick one, Jews or Palestinians. No coherent understanding of anti-racism can require racial oppression, period. This is the foundational and overwhelming incoherence in CIJA's supposedly anti-racist advocacy. While at times expressed indirectly, the consistent narrative advanced by CIJA is that Palestinian oppression is, whether intentionally or unfortunately, a necessity of Jewish safety. This necessity, however, is not built on politics of anti-racism, but rather a politics of racism. As I noted earlier, the Palestinian critique is fundamentally an anti-racist critique, anti-occupation, apartheid, genocide. And CIJA's obfuscation of that racial oppression is precisely what makes its superficial anti-racist advocacy rather racist advocacy that seeks to maintain the structures of racial domination that have oppressed Palestinians for a century. For just one notable example, CIJA has consistently advocated for the defunding of UNRWA, the main body that distributes food to people throughout Gaza, based on the outrageous claim that 10% of UNRWA's 12,000 Gaza staff are terrorists. This advocacy by CIJA directly parrots Israeli state propaganda and anti-Arab stereotypes. The International Court of Justice, just yesterday, ruled that these spurious allegations were unsubstantiated. And as the Jewish Faculty Network critically adds, the so-called confessions obtained by Israel from 9, not 1,200, UNRWA staff about their involvement in terrorism were coerced confessions extracted through torture. Israel's starvation of Gaza is an essential mechanism for its genocide. Consequently, CIJA's mendacious discrediting of the main body that distributes food to people throughout Gaza both justifies and promotes Israel's genocide, the very opposite of anti-racist advocacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all of your remarks. This report really builds on the work of Jewish faculty network members, but it also really relies heavily on the legal, anti-racist, and anti-colonial work of our colleagues across movements, especially in the Palestine Solidarity Movement. We're going to open the chat for participants now to send questions for panelists while I conclude our prepared remarks by repeating the key takeaways for our report, followed by recommendations. Analysis of our data reveals, number one, CIJA promotes anti-Palestinian racism through the idea that unrestricted violence against Palestinians is necessary for Jewish safety. CIJA promotes anti-Palestinian racism through a false narrative linking the movement for Palestinian rights with the rise of anti-Semitism in Canada. CIJA engages in anti-Semitism by defining Jewish identity as Zionist and anti-Palestinian through its persistent exclusion of large segments of Jewish people and voices from a singularly presented Jewish community. CIJA promotes the false narrative that protecting Jews and combating anti-Semitism requires the restriction of civil liberties of pro-Palestinian protesters. Due to the prevalence of racism in CIJA's public statements, which operate to justify genocide, we recommend the following. Given the evidence of CIJA's racism, we recommend that educational institutions, governments, and other organizations do not invite CIJA to do anti-Semitism training and talks, or to give evidence or to consult on anti-Semitism. Journalists should exercise caution before asking CIJA to speak on issues related to anti-Semitism, Israel and Palestine, and issues related to Jewish people in Canada. The general public should exercise caution, avoiding reliance on or trusting information arising from CIJA as a representational voice of Jewish people in Canada. Law and policymakers and law enforcement officers should decline to engage CIJA on issues related to anti-Semitism, Israel and Palestine, and issues related to Jewish people in Canada. No public funding should be allocated to CIJA to undertake anti-racist work, including anti-Semitism training. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. And we are able to take some questions, and I'll refer back to my co-moderator, Jill, to field the first question.
The first question that we've received is, how can we focus on mobilizing the crowd into focusing on the legal term of genocide? And I think that was one of the focuses of our report, was to ensure that the entire framing it builds around the legal term genocide, and that's purposeful. Words matter, and words matter especially in law. And it's our view, as supported by the references we use in our report, that genocide is the only appropriate term to describe what's happening. And I think in terms of mobilizing it, we need to keep using it in as many ways as we can, including by using the report, if helpful.
We have another question that I'll put to our panelists. This is specifically to members of the Jewish Faculty Network, which is a question that asks, how do you challenge assertions that Jews critical of Israel are self-hating Jews, misled, or well-meaning but naive? And I'll put that to Larry and Sheryl.
Perhaps I can start here. I think I've been contemplating this accusation for a long time, and the Jewish community is the community I grew up in. It's family, and we all have members of family who are doing bad things, and sometimes we have to take them to task. And they may argue, "Oh, well, you hate me. You hate me because you're criticizing me." But we have to do it as honest people. And because we love that community, that's where we came from. So the accusation of self-hatred is such a ridiculous one, that the only way to show love to the Jewish community that we were brought up in is to say nothing when Israel's committing genocide. Just think about that for a moment and how ridiculous it is.
Sheryl, did you want to speak to that, or should we move on to another question?
Why don't you move on? I mean, I could, but why don't you move on, because time is short.
We have enough time if you just wanted to.
Oh, okay. I can't get my video to work, but
that's okay.
I'll just talk. I think the other side of this is that the Jews who are joining the anti-genocide movement, the Jewish version of that, are also, many of them, involved in recreating new forms of Jewish expression and life and politics. Being Jewish is important to them. So that is, the attempt to erase their good intentions or our good intentions really bumps up against the fact that a lot of people who do this work are very, very invested in Jewish life and are trying to wrestle, control of Jewish life away from regressive forces like CIJA. So this does not wash at all. There are anti-Zionist synagogues popping up all over the place. One starting in Toronto. There's a one that's been around for years in Chicago. This is just the divide is so stark within the Jewish community right now between those who support the genocide and those who do not, that there's desperation on the part of those who do, from the Zionist institutions, to use any means necessary to discredit Jews who are trying to oppose the genocide.
Thank you so much, Sheryl. We have another question about how this report will be used in educational institutions. And the Jewish Faculty Network does have a campaign right now that we're running through our own network. And I want to turn to Jill Rogan to explain a bit about that campaign and to invite people to get involved.
Thanks, Shiri. So the Jewish Faculty Network is making all efforts right now to send the report to university administrators across Canada. And that's part of the hope that we hope this report will be used for by people who take issue with the positions that universities, politicians, lawmakers, police, law enforcement are taking, but that this report can provide a solid framing and grounding for arguments against the weaponization of anti-Semitism and the promotion of anti-Palestinian racism in the time of a genocide. So we're really hoping that people will use this report in meetings with their school board trustees, as I said, politicians, lawmakers, anyone who is engaged in making decisions about who to consult on issues relating to Israel and Palestine, who to consult within the Jewish community in Canada, not that it's a monolith, and how to respond to a genocide.
Thank you, Jill. There are so many excellent questions coming in right now. I'll try to read some of them and put them to our panelists in the last 5 or 6 minutes that we have. I just want to answer two general questions. One is where to find the report. jewishfaculty.ca has a report page that's dedicated to information about the report and where we'll be adding resources in the coming weeks. And this webinar is being recorded, and we're planning to put it online with the consent of participants, and also to maybe cut up some clips and share it online for people to be able to circulate this analysis far and wide. I'll start with a few questions. One of them is a question about how this report relates to other legacy Jewish organizations like B'nai B'rith and Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center. Another question is about the history of Jewish institutions and the role that CIJA plays within them, which we addressed briefly in the report, but is really the subject of some of the original and critical scholarship that members of the JFN are doing, including Jill Rogan and Sheryl Nestel and Larry Haiven. So I'll put that question to them. Other questions that are coming in are about decoupling notions of Jewish safety from support for Israel, and asking about systemic racism. So I'll read the question. What is the difference between the increase in acts of vandalism on Jewish institutions since October 7th and the lack of systemic racism? It's a great question. There are also questions about whether the report can be used within the school system, the primary school system and high school systems as well, where CIJA has played a role. And questions about who legitimately should represent Jewish people, if not CIJA. There's many more questions coming in, about 35. So I'm going to put it to the panelists to see if there's any of these questions that they'd like to pick up before concluding and maybe making some final remarks.
Maybe I'll take the question about the shift in the 1960s. My researching looks at the origins of hate speech legislation in Canada, and it includes archival research on the Canadian Jewish Congress, who was a key player in the 1950s and 60s, making vast shifts in the legislative landscape of Canada, including advocating for anti-discrimination frameworks, human rights frameworks, anti-discrimination work in the immigration context, and also hate speech legislation. And at that time, in the late 40s, early 50s, early 60s, there was a real upswing of white nationalism, anti-Semitism, and neo-Nazism. And that's what originally was the response, was hate speech legislation. There was a lot of people were advocating for hate speech legislation. One of the shifts that I've found in the work of the Canadian Jewish Congress to address anti-Semitism was that they had a joint anti-Semitism committee of people that worked against anti-Semitism. And literally days after the 1967 Six-Day War, in the Israeli-Arab War, as it's sometimes called, there was an immediate shift of that committee that addressed anti-Semitism to looking at anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism. And that had not, previous to that moment, been part of that committee's work. And from then on, you saw the Canadian Jewish Congress adopting more overt Zionist positions, even though they had always been Zionist. And you also see, interestingly, almost a total breakdown in solidarity work between the Canadian Jewish Congress and the Black community, for example, in Canada, where there had been solidarity. And so that's the trajectory that I'm following in my work, and it's really interesting. And I think, as a very wise advisor of mine once said, history is everything. And I think I'll pass it to others on the panel. I see Larry has his hand up to address some of the other beautiful questions coming in.
I just wanted to talk about the move of the Jewish mainstream or the Jewish legacy organizations away from, away from the universalistic approach. Back more than 50 years ago, in fact, up until about 35 years ago, the Jewish community pursued its social justice goals by uniting with other groups horizontally. Schools, Muslim organizations, Christian organizations. That's how they did it, and they campaigned for human rights. They were responsible for the setting up of human rights commissions. There's a case that I was involved in Saskatoon that started about 1990, where certain school boards were having kids recite the Lord's Prayer. And we decided to have a campaign against that. Among other religious organizations, we approached the mainstream Jewish community, and at the time, they declined. They didn't want to make trouble. That was not the way they wanted to operate. And it was only after 10 years of campaigning that they finally came in. We won that case, but the neglect of Jewish mainstream organizations of working with others has declined even further, or the neglect has continued even further to this day, where, as I said in my remarks, they actively shun it. They will not cooperate with other groups. Their main goal is to accuse of anti-Semitism, and to become more and more isolated in doing so.
Josh, go ahead.
I just want to comment briefly on the question about decoupling Jewish safety from support for Israel. Not only does Jewish safety differ from support for Israel, but support for Israel, in fact, often creates Jewish unsafety. As October 7th made plain, ethno-nationalism merely provides an illusion of Jewish safety while guaranteeing the Palestinian oppression that generates Palestinian resistance. This is the zero-sum analysis that I decried in my earlier remarks. Everyone's safety is best achieved through freedom and equality. But in any event, no one's safety, perceived or otherwise, can justify the occupation, apartheid, and genocide that Palestinians endure.
Thank you so much, Josh. And we're going to pass things on to Jill to wrap things up. But we just want to note that if we didn't get to your question, we have read them all, and we've noted the appetite for more organized and coordinated campaign and organizing around the report. And the Jewish Faculty Network will be following up on that.
I want to end by addressing one of the questions that came in, and then I'll wrap up with thanks and praise for all of the speakers and panelists today. One of the questions was about the claims that I guess that CIJA represents all Jews, and the ways in our report that highlights the anti-Semitic nature of many of the claims that CIJA makes. In our report, we detail the ways that the treatment of Jewish people in Canada as a monolith, as having one voice, the claim that CIJA represents that voice in Canada, homogenizing Jewish identity and erasing anti-Zionist Jewish identity, repeating dual loyalty tropes that Jewish people ought to have reverence for an ethno-nationalist genocidal state, a Jewish state, quote unquote. These are all what we analyze as anti-Semitic in our report. And I think that's a really important point of our report in thinking about Jewish safety. So I'd like to conclude our time together today by thanking firstly my co-authors who are brilliant, all of the peer reviewers who took time and energy to make this report impeccable, to all of the research assistants who are not named for their own safety. And especially today, I would like to thank our colleagues, Elle Jones, Dania Majid, and Joshua Sealy-Harrington, who took time out of their day to express their brilliance and their solidarity. We are incredibly grateful for your time, energy, activism, and your brilliance. So thank you everybody for attending today. And we're going to close the event now.